President Yoon is visiting Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan this week as part of broader diplomatic efforts aimed at expanding regional partnerships on supply chains and more. So where do Korea's ties with Central Asia stand? What is the significance of Korea's planned summit with Central Asia next year? And what is the K-Silk Road initiative? Hello and welcome. It's Monday, June 10th here in South Korea and you're watching Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. We are looking ahead to separate summit talks between South Korea and three of its Central Asian counterparts this week, namely Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Now for more on the upcoming bilateral interactions and their implications, I have our panel of foreign pundits here in the studio. I have Andres, a correspondent with Spanish news agency EFE. Andres, it's good to see you again.
Thank you, Sunny. It's always good to be here. Thank you for having us.
Right. I also have Jacco, the host of NK News podcast with us. Jacco, welcome back.
I'm delighted to be here again.
Right. Andres, let's begin then with some general information about the Central Asian country Turkmenistan and its ties with South Korea.
Well, I think it's important to point out also how important this trip by President Yoon is because of the increasing importance, strategically speaking, of these three Central Asian countries in terms of energy resources. And, you know, given how instability has grown around anything dealing with supply chains, especially since the war in Ukraine started and what's going on in the Middle East, I think it's more important than ever that the president is overtaking this trip, a trip that, by the way, was already done by President Moon almost in exact order in 2019. He also visited Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, which I think underlines the importance of these three particular countries in Central Asia for Korea. When it comes to Turkmenistan in particular, this is probably the less well-known country among the three, especially among Koreans. It's a huge country, like almost all of these countries in the Central Asian region, bordered by the Caspian Sea, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Iran, Afghanistan. It's like, I'd say 5 times the size of Korea, but it has a seventh of its population, I think, around 7 million people, basically because it's mostly desert. And a country that is ruled by the Bete Muhammado family, quite poor records in terms of human rights and democracy, unfortunately, but one of the largest gas reserves in the world. So in this sense, infrastructure and energy are probably the main fields of cooperation we can talk about between Korea and Turkmenistan. And there's this, for example, a good example of this is the Kinyanli petrochemical complex, which was completed in 2018 by a Korean and Japanese consortium of companies, and it was financed, for example, partially by the Exim Bank, by Korea's Export-Import Bank. We have companies like Hyundai Engineering, Hyundai Corporation, LG Group companies. SK Telecom also has operations in Turkmenistan. The telecommunications field apparently is growing when it comes to bilateral relations, but not everything in this case has to do with gas and engineering, because in the past few years, both Korea and Turkmenistan have been cooperating in the healthcare sector with, for example, many Turkmen medical professionals taking training courses imparted by Korean institutions, including Korean traditional medicine, which I think is quite interesting.
Right. And after the visit to Turkmenistan, the presidential delegation, Jacco, will be moving to Kazakhstan. What can you tell us about this nation and its ties to South Korea?
Yeah, the historical ties between Kazakhstan and Korea go back a long way, actually. at least 90 years. During the time of Stalin's leadership of the Soviet Union, many thousands of Koreans were forcibly transported from the far east of Siberia to Central Asia. Some of them ended up in Kazakhstan, and so today about 120,000 of their ethnic Korean descendants, who are known as Koryo-saram, they live in Kazakhstan. There's that historical element there. Now also the Republic of Korea and Kazakhstan, they normalized diplomatic relations quite soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, and a Kazakhstani embassy was opened here in South Korea in 1996, incidentally the year that I first came here. Probably no causal link there. There are currently 11 direct flights a week between Seoul and Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan. There's quite a bit of traffic there. Since last year, the two countries have been in discussions to sign a bilateral trade and investment promotion framework, or TIPF, to further strengthen these trade and economic ties. Now, even without such a framework, already in 2022, bilateral trade between these two countries reached $6.53 billion US, and Kazakhstan exports oil, refined petroleum products, mineral resources, amongst other things, to Korea. And Korea exports automobiles, electronics, textiles and clothing, and steel products, among others. Now, I also want to mention that probably Kazakhstan's most famous private university, KIMEP, was founded and has been led by Dr. Bang Chan-yong at the personal invitation of Kazakhstan's then president since the founding of that school in the early 1990s. Now, Dr. Bang was actually born in colonial Korea in 1936 and graduated from Yonsei University before moving to the United States, where he was recruited to come and open KIMEP. So this makes KIMEP a strong point of connection between Korea and Kazakhstan, as well as the US. Now, President Moon Jae-in visited Kazakhstan in 2019, and current Kazakhstan President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev paid a state visit to Seoul in August 2021, the first foreign leader to do so during the pandemic period. So relations are good, and visits at various levels of the government are constantly ongoing.
Right, good to know. Andres, President Yoon ends his Central Asia trip in Uzbekistan. Again, what can you tell us about this Central Asian country?
As opposed to Turkmenistan, which is, as I said, the less known and probably the most remote of these three countries. I believe the first president to visit Turkmenistan was Park Geun-hye around 2013 or 2014. When it comes to Uzbekistan, I think the ties are strong or even run deeper than the ones with Kazakhstan because precisely of the big Koryo-saram population in Uzbekistan as well. There's, I believe the community size is around 170,000 Koryo-saram people living in Uzbekistan, and actually Korea was one of the first countries in the world to recognize Uzbekistan when it broke off from the Soviet Union back in 1991. And actually, since relations were established in 1992, I think almost every Korean president has actually visited, not everyone, but almost every Korean president has visited Uzbekistan. And then, for example, Islam Karimov, the former president of Uzbekistan, was quite a familiar face in Seoul, because I believe he visited more than a dozen times during his tenure. Current President Mirziyoyev visited after he took power in 2016. And as we were saying before, former President Moon Jae-in also visited Uzbekistan in 2019. Now, of course, as you can see, with all this high-level exchange at the level of chiefs of state, both countries actually share a strategic partnership for more than a decade already. You know, I would say to Uzbekistan, Korea is probably around the fourth largest trading partner overall. And Uzbekistan, I'd say after Kazakhstan, is Korea's probably largest trading partner in the Central Asian region. So I do have some data from the embassy here. Currently, around 900 investment projects involving Korean capital ongoing in Uzbekistan, and common bilateral trade reached in 2022 $2.3 billion USD. So we see partnerships in the economic, in the trade, also in the cultural field, even in the humanitarian field. KOICA, the Korean International Cooperation Agency, has a lot of ongoing projects in Uzbekistan. And when it comes to the economic relationship, for example, I was telling Jacco before how I remember this. This goes back a long time. Like Daewoo Motors, before it turned into GM Korea, actually started manufacturing cars in Uzbekistan through a joint venture in the late 90s. Up all the way through the beginning of the 2000s, and now companies, for example, like LG Telecom, have joint ventures in Uzbekistan too. Uzbekistan is also a country that has lots of gas, and there's another good example of cooperation in this field. There's the Ustyurt, I don't know if I said it well, Ustyurt gas chemical complex that also produces polyethylene, all these kinds of plastics. It's half operated by a Korean consortium of companies that include Korea Gas Corporation, Lotte Chemical Corporation, some companies from the GS Group. And on top of that, Uzbekistan also has very important strategic minerals that are interesting. For example, molybdenum, which is very important for steel makers. So we would have a big interest, for example, from companies like POSCO in this field. Graphite, which is used to manufacture batteries. Uranium, which is basic to run nuclear power plants. So as we can see, Uzbekistan basically sells resources, some agricultural products to Korea mainly, while Korea sells cars, machinery, construction equipment, etc. But there's even more prospect of growth in this area, given that both countries have actually said around 2021 that there should be talks for the future signing of a free trade agreement, of an FTA. So.
Right, indeed. And Jacco, prior to the presidential trip to Central Asia, the top office here back last Friday spoke about a fresh diplomatic mission, perhaps with Central Asia, dubbed K-Silk Road Initiative, which the top office hopes will be explored at the summit between Korea and Central Asia next year. Now, we haven't heard much about this upcoming summit, of course, but what has been released thus far about the planned summit, and what can you tell us about this proposed Silk Road Initiative?
Yeah, I don't know too many details about next year's planned summit, but what I know is that President Yoon's current trip to Central Asia, to these three nations that we've just mentioned, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, he has one-on-one summit meetings with the leaders of each of these three nations, at which he hopes to lay the groundwork for this Central Asia-Korea summit to take place here in Seoul next year, involving not just those three countries, but also Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the other two pieces of the five former Soviet republics in Central Asia. Now, at that summit, he will probably discuss in greater detail this K-Silk Road initiative, harking back to the original Silk Road that linked the Eurasian landmass for about 2,000 years, but adding a K in front of it to give it a uniquely Korean stamp, as we must do with all things these days. Now, here's how the Korean government summarizes the K-Silk Road initiative. So this is what I have from government information. Firstly, there's a focus on critical mineral supply and energy sources, which Andres has already hinted at. Secondly, official development assistance, or ODA, specifically strengthening the public services of those five countries and supporting industrialization in those countries. Then expanding people-to-people exchanges and networks with the ethnic Koreans who live there, the Koryo-Saram. And lastly, institutionalizing cooperation and supporting industrial exchanges. So those are the sort of the four major areas that it wants to focus on. But this is not the first time that a special project linking Korea to Central Asia has been floated in recent years. Just 5 years ago, in April 2019, when speaking at Uzbekistan's legislative chamber, then Korean President Moon Jae-in spoke of a 21st century Iron Silk Road linking Korea to Central Asia by rail. Of course, that would necessitate going through North Korea if that ever worked. I don't know if that Silk Road ever went anywhere, obviously, because relation between the two Koreas got bad, but one gets the feeling that each successive president probably has some vision for Central Asia that includes a Silk Road reference somehow. Now, of course, we have to wait and see how these Central Asian nations react to the K-Silk Road Initiative. Are they interested in it? What's in it for them? Do they welcome this? These 5 nations all have agency in their relationship with South Korea too. They're not just passive recipients of Korean largesse, so we really have to wait and see how interested they are.
Right, we do. And Andres, this Envision Korea Central Asia Summit for next year follows the more recent summit that Korea had with Africa. We have a bit of time left, so what can you tell us about your major takeaways from the Korea-Africa Summit?
Well, I think it was first of all, it was a big event. Tens of representatives from, I believe it was 50?
48.
48, sorry, almost 50 African nations present in this summit. And this is a first. This is the first time that Korea decides to hold this summit. So a stepping stone in that sense, signaling that it wants bigger and better relationships with the whole continent. And then on the practical side of it, there was around, I believe, more than 50 documents between, MOUs, EPAs, economic partnership agreements signed between Korea and individual countries, of course, on the sidelines of all. The summit, President Yoon got to meet a lot of chiefs of state. And as I say, important in the sense of being a stepping stone in regards to, for example, increasing economic and trade relations with a strong focus, of course, on mineral resources, for example. But also in fields like basic infrastructure. Africa is, of course, a continent that needs crucial infrastructures. For example, memorandums were signed, for example, for Korean companies to provide capital, crucial electrical equipment for electricity production in Mozambique, for example. But it's not only about what Korea can, of course, get from this relationship. What African countries also can be interested in what Korea can bring to the relationship. For example, in this case, we do know that Korea is a famous global example of a country that was a net recipient of aid and has turned to a net donor. So not only in terms of development, but I think also in terms of good governance, Korea has a lot to offer to many of these countries, I think. And then, of course, when it comes to dealing with Africa as a bloc on diplomatic terms, we tend to think many times that these countries, especially in arenas like the UN, many times turn to vote in blocs. But then it's also important to point out that, of course, every single country has their own very specific agendas. So it's important that Korea actually gets to know and spends time learning a bit more about each country's agenda, because the current government has called it its mission to turn Korea into a global pivotal state. And of course, that is something that cannot happen overnight. You need to be persistent, and you need to show lots of interest. So I really hope that this could turn, this Korea-Africa summit could turn into something that is held annually.
Right. Mm-hmm. And Jacco, expanding on what Andres has just said, many pundits here in the country believe that closer collaboration between Korea and the African continent will also serve Korea's diplomatic interests. What are your thoughts?
Maybe so. South Korea is currently a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, along with African countries Algeria and Sierra Leone. So this brings Korea into a situation where it must closely align and cooperate and collaborate with these two African states and their diplomats in the United Nations Security Council. But of course, there are 54 nations in Africa in total, so almost all of them were represented here in the summit. Each of them has their own interests and values, but you don't yet hear a lot in the news about large-scale Korea-Africa trade or people-to-people exchanges or joint projects. Now, of course, KOICA, the Korea International Trade Cooperation Agency, it is carrying out projects here and there throughout Africa and other places. But if Korea wants to improve its diplomatic clout in Africa, it needs a clearer vision and a more unified foreign policy, one that is longer term. And in saying this, I'm actually paraphrasing Dr. George Junhua, who's a research fellow at Seoul National University's Asia-Africa Center. Now, unfortunately, longer-term unified policies are things that governments find particularly hard to do because you're always looking at the next election cycle, and once you've got that kind of a policy, it's then becomes difficult to apply it. So, and those 54 countries, as I said, they've got their own interests and their own agencies, so they will decide to what extent to engage with South Korea's vision and offers. And add to that mix the fact that Korea is also kind of competing with China in the African space for attention and projects, with China's Belt and Road Initiative and Sino-African Industrial Cooperation that's happening as well. So the Korean government needs to decide whether it will be able to see the return on the investment that it wants to see, and that will probably determine the path forward, I think.
Right, indeed. We'll have to wait and see then. All right, Jacco, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Andres, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to be here.
Right, well, that ends today's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Be sure to join us again, same time tomorrow.